Can you hear me now in the back? Yes? All right. All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. As people trickle in, just guide them to the pizza and whatnot. Feel free to get it at whatever point in time you want. So quick show of hands, who's here for the first time? All right, welcome. So this is Bleeding Edge Web, and we kind of break this down into, there's two talks tonight. There's a recurring segment, which is news from the Bleeding Edge I'll be giving tonight. And then the main course is the real user measurements and development lifecycle with Ken Harker. So a couple of quick housekeeping things. Just note we're always looking for sponsors, speakers, and it doesn't have to be a full talk even. We have a lot of lightning talks typically. We don't have any tonight, but it's a common thing. So if you're interested in speaking, feel free to reach out to us through Meetup, through email. You can reach me, Corey at edgeatx.org, or on Twitter, or basically any of the channels that we have listed. And if your company is interested in sponsoring, we have you can look at edgeatx.org for that as well. One quick thing, if you parked here in the Omni building, don't forget to pick up your parking validation before you leave. It's good until 10 p.m. You have to be out by 10 p.m. in order to get the $7 rate. Otherwise, you're going to get charged for the full day, which is like 30 some odd dollars. So make sure you get your validation before you leave. And then I'll be sticking around. We typically stick around after the event for a little while down in just in the lobby, drink what's left of the beer, and just kind of socialize and carry on the conversation a little bit. So I'll be doing that tonight. I don't know if Ken. I don't know if you're planning. He's shaking his head yes. So we'll be down there. So feel free to join us for that afterwards. So quick shout out to sponsors, Capital Factory for this space. Obviously, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. Not listed, but we can thank Brian, he's primary organizer of the group. I'm the co-organizer of the group. He's the one that really sprung for the pizza tonight, even though he's not here. So thank you, Brian, if you're watching online. So without further ado, we'll get to news from the Bleeding Edge. Quick browser update. So we do, does anybody know where we're at? Last month was an interesting month because there weren't updates, which is the first ever in the 8 or 9 years that we've been doing this event. But anybody want to take a gander at what, any ideas where we're at today? This is where we were at our last check, which was actually in May. I forgot to update the date. No? Okay. So we've only seen updates in Chrome and Firefox. We're at version 75 and 67, respectively. The asterisk here with Edge we'll get to, and really no changes in Safari. And for those that don't know, we don't cover like Opera and some of those others because they're based on Chromium. So pretty much everything that's in Chrome is relevant to Opera and some of the other browsers like Edge, which is now also based on Chromium. So this month, not a whole lot that I found of interest. There are a lot of changes, a lot of updates to the browser, but really the two that stood out to me were this stale while revalidate attribute, which it's really for performance in your web apps. It essentially allows you to, the way they state it is removing stale assets from the critical path. So if you think of it almost like the flow of assets that are coming into your page, you can essentially hold off and kind of cache these. It's actually implemented through a caching header. So as a result of this, you can kind of tweak your pages a little bit to just not worry about stale assets right away, which would be things like images and video content and other kinds of things that are going to get loaded into your local browser cache. So if performance is important to the applications that you develop, this is an interesting thing, albeit fairly small, but it can make an impact on the performance of your sites. The other was scroll, snap, and stop. Has anybody seen this yet? Nope. Okay. So this is, I'm going to show it. You'll understand right away. This is essentially stopping inertia of like here. I'm going to try see if I can do this here one-handed. All right. All right. pizza grease on my hands apparently. Just trying to slide this across, I'm just swiping, and you notice that it's just going from slide to slide here, as opposed to just scrolling the whole distance. So this is something that's now baked into Chrome. So if you are doing any kind of mobile web apps, or if this is something, maybe you're working on touchscreen devices, this might be of interest to you. Firefox had significantly more updates. This first one here, suspending unused tabs. If you're like me and you end up having way too many tabs open at the same time, this can be a useful feature, because if it's unused, it's essentially not going to be consuming memory or other computing resources. Google did this in Chrome probably 7 or 8 releases ago, and it doesn't really work the way that you would expect it to. So if you are expecting this to just prevent, if you just expect Firefox to all of a sudden be a bit more performant, it may be, it may not be. Verdict's still out on how useful this will actually be, and whether or not they are following in Chrome's footsteps, or if they've implemented a different way of reducing the strain on your computer when you're not using a particular tab within the browser. They've also lowered the priority of set timeout. What that means, if you are using set timeout in your applications, it's another performance thing. It's kind of about delaying the processing of this. It's a pretty minor element, but it can make a difference if you use this heavily. So if it's something, if your applications are very time sensitive and you are using set timeout, definitely check that out. They have also started implementing a number of different security measures, I guess you could say. Most notably, the ability to block known crypto miners. So if you are on a web page that maybe isn't the most savory, you can block specific, or you can block any kind of known crypto miner that you identify or that Mozilla identifies, and that's set in a custom setting within Firefox. So that's kind of more of typically in this talk, we like to discuss more about the actual language features. That one is, it's not so much a language feature, obviously, because this is just a setting in the browser, but it is something that can impact pages and performance, especially if you're doing testing and things like that. So, so it is something to kind of keep in mind. And then we have dynamic module imports. This is something that has been in the ECMAScript specification for a while now, but it has finally landed in Firefox. Again, something that they're kind of playing catch up a little bit to Chrome here. And the string.matchAll. Anybody use regexes heavily? A couple folks? Okay. So matchall is really just a new native implementation. You've probably already seen the spec. Or have been using it. There have been polyfills for this for a little while in different libraries, but it is now available directly and natively in Firefox 67. And again, keeping kind of with the theme of security here, with these updates, desktop notifications are now restricted to sites that have TLS, which is SSL, so HTTPS. If you don't have that, you're not going to be able to use desktop notifications in Firefox. And this is following along with something of an industry standard that's been emerging, indicating that if you're going to be using what's known as a Power API, then you have to have TLS enabled on your site. So this kind of falls under that category of being a Power API. So Edge, not really anything new in Edge, but the dev channel, if you're a Windows user, remember that Edge is tied to the Windows build, so you may be receiving a dev channel update. That will be the first edition of Edge that's actually based on Chromium. So you'll start to see more of kind of that Chrome feel coming into Edge. Pretty much, I think it's set to be released in a couple of days. So that's really about it for the browsers. Again, not a whole lot of news here from them, but there has been some industry news. How many Node folks in here? All right, fair number. And if you're not a Node person, you're probably still using Node for build tools and things like that. But so if anybody hasn't been following along with the news with NPM, there has been a number of HR entanglements happening over the last couple of months. And it's starting to show in the code base. So the one of the later versions, 6.9.1, which is the latest edition of the NPM command line tool, has not had any commits in the last 3 months. Now, why is that? Because most of that core team is no longer with NPM. So if this link to the job cuts here kind of goes into some of the details about that, but their CTO left, which will be important in a slide or two here, and there's just a whole lot of shakeup going on with NPM. And the main reason that I'm telling you all of this is because if you are using NPM, which pretty much the entire 8 million user base of people using Node are leveraging NPM or Yarn, this could potentially affect you just because the community is changing a little bit. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. The other updates are now NPM is using, or they now have token support. So if you publish packages with a token, that will be verified by GitHub's new token service. It's kind of like a checksum. So if you download an application, from GitHub and want to verify its signature, it's very similar to that, except at a more micro level. Again, with your Node modules. A couple of notable releases, HA Proxy. Anybody use HA Proxy in here? All right, well, I can guarantee you're using it on the web because about 80% of the web is leveraging either HA Proxy or Nginx. So this has been around for 15 years, I think now, just hitting 2.0. There's a ton of changes there. So if you're not familiar with proxies, this is definitely one to take a look at, and especially these new changes. It's mostly about acceleration and being able to apply a lot more logic at the network stack. So proxy, for anyone who does not know, often sits in front of a web server or in front of an API server. It can do things like you can technically do authentication through it. You can do routing through it. You can even modify web requests through a proxy. And so those types of things are a little bit easier to do in HA Proxy too. There's also WSL2. This is basically Docker for Windows. Any other Windows users? Yeah, no, there's not a whole lot of us in here. But I'm a big Docker user, and I've had some challenges with Docker on Windows in different ways. But this is an interesting release because it's basically everything is now based on a full Linux kernel. So when you are actually running Docker on Windows, you're not leveraging an emulator, you're not leveraging a shim or anything like that. You're actually leveraging a full Linux kernel. So you can expect to see better support for the containers that you would be using within Docker. And so that's not only interesting just from a technical perspective, it's interesting from the Microsoft perspective. I mean, if you ask yourself 10 years ago, would you ever even see Linux in the same sentence with Microsoft? It would only be if there were a flame war going on. So this is kind of an interesting progression. Just as far as Microsoft's commitment to open source code and to open source work in general. And then Pika, this is I think I'm pronouncing it right. This is a JavaScript specific CDN. If you haven't seen this, we have spoken about this in the past in this meetup, but they've made some changes. The reason that this particular CDN is interesting is because it allows you to leverage essentially the latest modern JavaScript, essentially, being able to use things like module imports and that type of stuff. So you can see in their code example here that you're able to import directly from a URL. And so that's great if you're building applications for more modern browsers. If you still have to support older browsers, it may not work quite as well for you. But it is kind of an interesting, just an interesting trend that I recognized this month. And then Node 12.4 was released. The most notable part of that is that it now has JSON module support, and I won't get into the details of that, but if anybody's curious, feel free to talk to me afterwards. And in case you missed it, a lot of industry news this month. So anybody here ever used PullPanda before? Because honestly, this one was new to me. I had not seen it before. The company is only about 1.5 years old. GitHub bought them. It's about handling pull reminders, pull analytics, pull assigners, basically everything that you can think of around pull requests. So it's just another step in the evolution of GitHub and with Microsoft at the helm of that. So kind of interesting. I'm sure probably most people have already heard because it's been big news in the last couple of days about Facebook launching a cryptocurrency. So this particular link goes out to their GitHub repo. So if you are interested in the internals of that, check it out. And then in a little bit of a twist, Mozilla is launching a paid version of Firefox. Don't worry, this is not the same as the Firefox that you've known over the last God knows how many years. This is it basically comes with a VPN. That's really what it is. I think they're going to charge like $10. I just can't remember if it's 10 a month or if it's $10 for license in general. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the good point here that essentially that's the cost of the VPN. But it is going to be all bundled with Firefox, so just a new business move for them. And then the other one that I found most interesting of industry news was Entropic, which is a decentralized package registry. This is the registry that was started by the ex-CTO of NPM. So the idea here is that NPM is a commercial entity that essentially manages 97% of modern web code, because that's how much exists in NPM today. So it's an awful lot. It also means that you're always hitting one central registry for all of your code. This is very different from other communities like the Go community, where when you import code in Go, you're importing from a distributed system. So they use GitHub for the most part. So if you're doing an import in Go, you're usually importing from a GitHub library. This concept here of Entropic or Entropic, however they're pronouncing it, it's similar conceptually, but it's not designed just for node modules. It's designed for all code. So it's, to some degree, it's supposed to be the package manager to rule all package managers. When you think about that, that's an enormous space between Node and PHP and Python and Go and even the Ruby packages and gems. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff out there. That we depend on in everyday use of our code. So this is definitely something to keep an eye on, because it will change how we work if it takes off. And then this one was kind of interesting. Did anybody else see the state of CSS results for 2019? Because this was fairly new to me. I'm going to try to make this a little bigger. Hopefully, yeah, it's just making the text bigger. Okay. So again, this is a link out to the actual results, but there were these dots here that you see. There's a couple of different areas. There's shapes and graphics, animations and transitions, some layout stuff, interactions. The dots inside, so the dark blue represents people that have actually used this tech. The light blue rings represent people that know about it but haven't necessarily used it. And so if you take a look at this, it's kind of interesting, because this particular one over here with animations and transitions is the one that has the most usage so far. And that's transforms, transitions, and animations. A whole bunch of other stuff going on, like the calc function in CSS and Flexbox, also fairly widely used at this point. And a whole bunch of stuff that people are aware of but haven't actually been using. And so the trend that this suggests is that there's a lot of room for improvement in CSS. And so in this meetup, we've spoken an awful lot about JavaScript over the last couple of years, because with the ECMAScript spec changing, it's been a lot of big news. But this is kind of the next frontier. We're going to see a lot of changes in CSS, especially as we start to see more programmatic use of things like calc and CSS variables and other types of things. So if you haven't checked this out, I strongly recommend looking at it, if nothing else, just to kind of give you a little bit of an eye into the future of where the web industry is going to be going. And then some old news that's slightly coming back a little bit is the IO and SH domain registrars. This one kind of hits me personally a little bit, because I own a bunch of .io and a couple of .sh domains. But it's an interesting situation. If you haven't heard, the UN recently, and when I say recently, it was back in February, they ruled that there's a dispute over the Chagos Archipelago, which is currently considered to be part of the British Indian Ocean area. And the dispute was was that actually a part of the UK, or was it part of Mauritius and the Seychelles? And long story short is the courts ruled that it was an illegal decolonialization of this region. And normally we wouldn't care as developers except for the fact that the registrars exist in the disputed region of the world. So the fact that that the UN has basically told the British, you got to let go of this, that could mean that the registrar ends up basically disappearing. And as a result, our .io domains will go away. Now, that's not to get everybody all freaked out about it, but because the real key here is whether or not the British will actually follow through on this. Is it something that they're going to enforce or not? Are they going to abide by the court or not? And the current answer to that is not yet. But it's kind of been resurfacing every couple of months or so. So if you are an owner of one of these domain names, just keep it in the back of your mind that may or may not be there. Realistically, it usually takes about 5 years for a domain to go away, so I'm personally not all that concerned, but it's still something to just think about, especially if your business is, if your branding is heavily emphasized on one of these domains, like a lot of the hip companies these days, then you might want to be thinking about that a little. And on the lighter side of things, I found this to be kind of amusing. This is the Clippy web component. So it's there's if you go to the link here, this was from a couple of folks on the Microsoft team, and I'm going to read this one passage. It just says, "I've spoken to several people in Microsoft, and we all agree it is a good idea," referring to Clippy. "We looked through a number of great software projects, mostly from Microsoft, and found lots of inconsistencies in the way Clippy is presented and invoked. Because users keep buying and using our products, I'm going to assume they all love Clippy as much as I do." So kind of a tongue-in-cheek approach to this. And if you look at the tweets that surrounding all of this, Google did the same thing with a toast element. So just some kind of jokes on, with a little bit of web component humor here, but you might actually see Clippy pop up somewhere as an Easter egg. So keep an eye on that in your code. And then this one was a Google.oops. If you are unfamiliar with HSTS, it's basically forcing people to use your website over an encrypted connection, so HTTPS. And Google, who maintains the registry of all of this for predefining, like you actually have to register your site and say, hey, here's my SSL certificate, and I want to preload myself. It's basically a trust registry, but Google doesn't. Even though they maintain the registry, even their site doesn't actually qualify for it. So I find that kind of amusing. And that's really about it. Not a whole lot more this month. So that's it. We'll get Ken up here and get the main talk going. So thank you. I totally forgot something. While he's getting ready here, normally we ask who's hiring and who's looking for work. So I'll just raise of hands. Is anybody looking for new opportunities right now? A couple of folks. Do you want to get up and say something? Because I'm happy to bring the mic around. Yeah, all the hands go down now. Okay. Well, feel free to hang out afterwards. Is anybody hiring? No? Okay. I know that even though he's not here, Brian is hiring. His company, Aunt Bertha, just picked up, I think, a $16 million Series C round. He's hiring engineers, so if you are in an engineering role, you might want to reach out to him. Good to go? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me tonight. I haven't met very many of you. Last month was actually the first time I've been able to attend one of these in person because you always conflict with my Cub Scout meetings during the school year. Just as a preface, I'm not actually a developer myself, but I have been in the web performance space for a very long time, working with companies to help them make their websites faster. I like to think of myself more as like a food critic than a chef, if that analogy works for most of you. So I'm not going to be going deep into code in my talk. I'm going to be talking a bit more about how once you have something out there on the web, what's available to you to sort of benchmark how fast it is, how users are experiencing it, and come up with the right plans and strategies to manage that performance as something that's just as important as functionality is to users. So I'm going to be talking a bit about Akamai stuff specifically because that's who I work for, but I will also try to make this generic. It's not going to be a pure Akamai talk, hopefully. So we're going to cover three big topics. One is just starting out looking at overall overview of what web performance management is, what the main strategies are, what the sort of greater ecosystem of it is right now, where real user measurements, which is what most of the talk will focus on, fit into that ecosystem. I'll then talk specifically about what RUM is, how it's implemented, how you use it, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of use cases that focus specifically on DevOps. How can you integrate using real user measurements into your development lifecycle with a couple of examples and one demo. So any questions before I get started? Awesome. So first we'll start with, why should you care about performance? Like most developers that I know focus primarily on making things work. They focus on functionality, on feature sets, and so forth. But focusing on performance is something that takes a bit of discipline for a lot of people and a bit of motivation. One of the things that we like to point out to customers is, because it's a bit surprising to people, is that not only do slow web experiences frustrate visitors and maybe make them less likely to use your site, that slow experience can have profound lasting impacts. A couple of years ago, Akamai did a bit of a study and found, and this kind of very abstracted here in this chart, but being slow is actually worse for most visitors than not being available. So if you go to a website and it's down, you can't get to it, there's a 9% chance that you'll never go back. But if it's something you want to visit or you had a reason to go there in the first place, you'll maybe try again later. But if you go there and you get a really frustrating experience, it's slow, it's not working, you're clicking on stuff, it's taking too long, there's about a 3 times as large chance that you're never going to go back. There's a persistent effect. Slow web pages can actually keep you from your customers from being willing to try you a second time. And this is kind of hard to really fully appreciate unless you start measuring things. So we've known that being slow is bad. I've been in this space for quite a while, and I remember back in 2006, there was a landmark study published by Google. They did some of the first real-world experiments to see, does being slow really, really impact things? And what they did is they began introducing 100 millisecond delays into small samples of their visitors who came to the web search engine. So what did, some people got 100 millisecond delay. Some people got an artificial 400 millisecond delay, or 500 millisecond, or 1,000 millisecond. And they measured what the behavior of the people in each one of these samples was, how they reacted with Google. And what they discovered is that the breaking point at the time was about 500 milliseconds. Adding another half second of delay reduced web searches by 25%. This is a big deal if your business is web searches and serving ads based on web searches. Well, 3 years later, Google and Bing actually got together and said, well, it's been 3 years. People have faster browsers, faster machines. Is this still really relevant? And they did some similar experiments and came up with, not only is it just as bad as it was, but it's actually getting worse. We're now able to measure as low as 200 milliseconds impacting user behavior. And 500 milliseconds was all it start to actually be impacting ad revenue for a site like Google. And really, since 2006, 2009, none of this has really changed. Performance is really still really super important. One of my good friends at Walmart.com in 2013, they did a study where they looked at their own data, and they determined that for every 100 milliseconds in page improvement in page load time for them resulted in a 1% increase in revenue. So if you think about how much money Walmart.com makes, I mean, they're not quite up there with Amazon yet, but they're still really, really big. A 1% increase in their revenue, how many FTEs does that pay for on the web dev team, right? It's a big, big deal. And they published this, and it was in some of the conferences. More recently, Akamai the online retail performance report. And we were able to determine that in 2017 that 100 millisecond delay in website page load time can hurt conversion rates by as much as 7%. And then the most interesting one I found recently is a fashion retailer called Missguided. I don't know if anybody's ever been to their website before. Anybody ever heard of this? They're a women's fashion site that focuses explicitly on people who are shopping for things 50 or 60. So they're like kind of like an overstock, but in that sort of space. Their target demo is pretty heavily Android based. The people who shop at their site are most likely to be doing it on a mobile phone, not on a desktop or laptop. And on the mobile phone space, they're most likely to have Android devices rather than more expensive iPhones. They used some real user measurement techniques to look at their performance, and they discovered that for their Android visitors, they had a much lower conversion rate than any other population visiting their site. And that's a problem if that's the biggest population visiting your site. And so they drilled into this and tried to figure out, well, where is the performance bottleneck? What's happening here? And they decided that Bazaar Voice might be the issue. And hopefully nobody here works for Bazaar Voice. Anybody here for Bazaar Voice? No? My next door neighbor works for Bazaar Voice. So Bazaar Voice is a third-party service used by many, many sites, many apps. It's used, among other things, to curate online commentary if you have reviews and so forth on your site. And it's also used to curate, is this a real person visiting the site or is this a bot, that sort of thing. They took it off for Android visitors. So they detect, are you on an Android device? If you are, we're just not going to load Bazaar Voice. It improved the performance of those pages by 4 seconds, and the conversion rate for their site as a whole went up 26%. It's a huge, huge difference. So there's lots of good motivational reasons why you care about performance. So the next question is, okay, now that I know performance really matters, especially to retail, but also I work with a lot of media companies, I work with a lot of financial services companies. It matters to every vertical, really. You need to be able to measure performance, but you probably want something better than a stopwatch. This is what we used to do like 16, 17 years ago. You click load and you'd have a stopwatch, or you'd use your wristwatch to time how long the pages took. You want something better than that. You want to be able to know where you're starting from. You need to be able to baseline, right now we're starting this performance program, we're going to go out and make performance important. Where are we starting from? Your measurements need to be accurate and complete. You don't want to be measuring some little part of the web experience, hoping that gets you what you want, and then ignoring the rest, and maybe sort of guessing that the rest falls in place. You want to be measuring everything. And we'll talk a bit about what that means. You want to be able to track changes over time. When you introduce changes to the site to try to improve things, obviously you want to find out, did that make it better? Or even if you're not changing things, your target demographic, the people visiting your site, are changing all the time. They're getting new devices, they're on different network connections. Are things staying the same? And ultimately what you want is a system of measurement that will let you identify whether you're being a success or a failure. So what are the approaches people have taken to this? There are 4 main technologies that we use to measure web performance. And there's some overlap between them, and there's a few edge cases of technologies out there that don't fit nicely into these boxes. But they basically break down to 4 strategies. The first one is called application performance measurements, or application performance monitoring. And I like to think of it as measuring the nuts and bolts of your infrastructure. So you're going to measure at the server side things like disk I/O, memory utilization, network congestion within your data center. It doesn't give you a lot of visibility by itself into what the user is experiencing. But the most sophisticated APM solutions will let you do things like trace, when a visitor hits your website, all the activities that happen on that page view within all of your backend systems. Synthetic measurements, these are where you have like this bot that goes out and hits your website as if it were a real person, pretending to be a real person. And typically, these are done with scripts where they'll go and hit the same set of pages in the same order, same transaction, if you will, repeatedly. And maybe they'll do this from 10 locations around the country every 15 minutes or something like that, to get a sample to probe for when anything breaks or changes, because you know that your tests are always the same test over and over again. Web analytics are services that are focused primarily on marketing teams, getting to understand your visitors, how they visit the site, what they're doing. A lot of them do have a performance component. They will tell you things like what the page load times were, but their main focus is understanding how visitors are interacting on the pages, what campaigns are working, what coupon codes are successful, that sort of thing. And then finally, we have real user measurements, or RUM. Some vendors will call this real user monitoring instead of real user measurements, but it comes out to the same acronym. And the idea behind that is we're going to ask our real visitors' own browsers to report back to us, how did the performance of the web page look? So I have here a few logos. These are not the only vendors in each of these spaces, but these are sort of what I think are the top dogs in each one of these. There is some overlap between them. So in the APM space, both New Relic and Dynatrace have a RUM offering as well as their primary line of business, which is application performance measurements. In fact, Dynatrace even also has a synthetic offering as well. I've worked with various companies. I used to work for a company that is now part of Dynatrace. Rigor has been a partner I've worked with. SpeedCurve has been a partner I've worked with on the synthetic side. In web analytics, it's really the big three are Adobe Analytics, Google Analytics, and what used to be called Core Metrics. It got acquired by IBM a few years ago. They called it IBM Digital Analytics for a while, and now it's like splintered and part of 6 or 7 different products, all of which have the brand name Watson somehow attached to them. So I just think of it as IBM now. And then in the RUM space, we have Akamai, which acquired a startup company called Sosta a couple of years ago that I was part of. That is how Akamai got into the real user measurement game. Google just recently, this spring, at Google I/O conference, announced Google Firebase Performance Monitoring, which is their real user measurement system. So if you use Google Firebase, you now have access to your own essentially free real user measurement system. They don't charge for it. And then the other big player in the RUM space is Blue Triangle, a small company out of Virginia. I know some of those folks as well. So we're going to be talking primarily about RUM, but before we do that, let's talk a bit about why you would want to invest in RUM, or why you want to look at RUM as part of your program. Because you may be thinking, hey, I've got web analytics, isn't that good enough? Or I've got synthetic, isn't that good enough? Well, there are some weaknesses here that RUM helps fill in the gaps. With APM, the big issue is that by itself, you don't get any visibility into anything beyond the firewall, essentially. You may not get any visibility into how your CDN is performing. You may not get visibility definitely into how the web browsers themselves are interacting with your content. JavaScript executes to different performance levels on different devices, different browsers. You have no visibility into that. You're also unable to track performance of third-party or platform services. So if you use things, if you're on Salesforce Commerce Cloud, for example, as a platform, you don't see some of the performance elements related to you don't see any performance elements related to third-party services on your pages. If you use like some kind of personalization service, for example, to pick out what products you want to serve a customer. Synthetic performance measurements, the big gap there is you get no insight into visitor engagement. You're not a real user. You're simulating a real user, so you have no idea about conversion and revenue. You have no way to track like people who get this performance level convert at this rate, people who get this slower experience convert at this much lower rate. None of that's available in synthetic. The other thing that's not on this slide is that synthetic is really challenging to simulate all the various mobile experiences out there. There's no way to realistically simulate the 15,000 different Android devices in the market, or all the different kinds of network connections with 5G, 4G, 3G, different levels of congestion on the cell and so forth. It's just really not possible to do that accurately. And then web analytics, again, as I mentioned, that's focused primarily on marketing and visitor behavior. It offers some, but typically not very deep insights into performance. So what's good about RUM, real user measurements? Well, I like to say RUM should be your ground truth for performance. It should tell you, because it's your real users telling you what their experience was. If your real user says it took 5 seconds for the page to load, you can believe that. It covers all the variety of your different visitors, no matter what their geography is, what kind of device they're using, what kind of connection they're on, what ISP they're on, what time of day. It covers everything. So you get you get that full coverage. You're not relying on a sample or hitting something every 15 minutes and hoping that's the right time to hit your site. But the really cool thing is it also captures performance and business metric data at the same time. So you can know if this visitor hits your site and they converted, you can know what their average user page load time was, as opposed to visitors that don't convert. And you can start leveraging that connection in making your business intelligence decisions. But there are still some challenges. The data sets can be extremely large. I work regularly with customers that have like 150 million page views a day, each one of which has 100 or 200 resource requests on each page. So you can very quickly get to the point where you're looking at hundreds of millions or billions or trillions in some cases of data points in like a month. The data is also noisy. Like you have all these visitors, you have these people on Hughes satellite connections in Nebraska and 2G network connections out in the middle of nowhere. It's easy to get lost in the noise at the tail end of the graphs. So you need powerful data visualization that helps you sort of drill into the meat of the matter. But once you start looking at RUM, the other thing you can do is get into how RUM can fold into your DevOps culture. So I'm going to talk a bit about all of these topics. But the idea behind RUM and DevOps is you should be able to pivot both your operational and your development resources on performance issues, on making performance a priority. And no matter what vendor you go with for RUM, whether it's Akamai or someone else, what you really should be looking for to fully leverage RUM in a DevOps environment are, first of all, being able to get at the data in real time. So that's always been kind of very important to our particular product. But you don't want to wait like an hour or a day to get some report out of a system. You want to be able to go and look at it right now. Alerts and reports, I think, are kind of table stakes in this game. Being able to look at multivariate testing or at different dimensions is really important. This is a feature that when Google introduced their brand new real user measurement system, they had that baked in from the very beginning. Being able to segment the data on things that are important to you, that are custom to your business. You want to be able to use real user measurements to validate performance and release. This is one of the major use cases I work with customers on. When you push out a major site release, you want to be able to validate that it didn't slow down the experience for the users. And RUM is the way to do that. You can benchmark all you want with synthetic, but your real users telling you what the performance is like is the ground truth. Annotations, I think, are really underappreciated with my customers, because if you use them effectively, and I'll talk about this more, you can almost, in many cases, have your diagnosis of any performance problem you encounter when you get to those dashboards. So if you're fully leveraging APIs to send in annotations to the real user measurement system when you do anything, when you push out a release, when there's an alert that goes off, a lot of times when you have a performance problem, you go to that real-time dashboard and you look at, okay, what's going on? Oh, look, here are all the annotations telling me exactly what happened. You don't need to drill in as much. It tells the story for you. It really helps you, be more efficient at managing performance. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about something we call ChatOps, which is tight integration of real user measurement into messaging systems and group chat systems that a lot of customers are, and including us at Akamai, use quite extensively. So any questions so far? Quiet crowd. All right, so brief introduction to RUM. How does RUM work? Each vendor is going to be a little bit different potentially, but they all are going to follow the same basic 4 components. You're going to need JavaScript snippet or tag, which is a little chunk of code. The one that we use at Akamai is about 800 bytes. That gets loaded on every page during the page load. It's going to kick things off. It's going to request 2 things: a JavaScript library that has all the core logic for how to talk to the browser to get the data out and send it back, and a configuration file that has things that are specific to your site, usually an identifier that says which site this is, where the data is going, and so forth. Depending on the vendor, 2 and 3 may actually be combined into a single resource. We at Akamai serve them as 2 separate requests, but you need both sets of information. And then at the end of the page load, at the end of the experience that's being measured, the RUM system will send a beacon, as we call it in the industry, of results back to a central repository system that includes typically all the performance data for that page load, as well as any business metrics that are captured as a result of your configuration file. So this is just a graphic I stole from another presentation at Akamai. One thing to note is that if you are using Akamai, the serving of those configuration files, the library, and the receiving of the beacon is all done on our CDN. So it can be spread out. If you have a global presence on your website, not everyone's fetching the resources from the same central repository. And when they send the beacon back, if they're in Europe, it's not having to come across the ocean to some server in California or something. But Google will be the same way. They will use their own CDN to do this as well. So once the page is loading and you've loaded this library of code and this configuration file, how does it talk to the browser? How does it get the information out? There's really 4 big W3C standard APIs that we leverage, or any RUM system would leverage. Navigation timing, resource timing, paint timing, and user timing. Is anyone familiar with any of these or ever used them before? Good. So you can actually play around with some of them in the browser if you open up your dev tools in like Chrome, for example, and just go to the console, type performance, and then everything under performance, that JavaScript variable, will include all the same timing information. These browsers, when they send the timing information to us, typically do it all in Unix epoch time, which makes things really very convenient for dealing with time zones and whatnot. So almost all of the modern browsers will support all of these standards, but there are a few exceptions, and a website that I love and I encourage all of you to visit is caniuse.com. Has anybody else been to Caniuse before? Oh, awesome. Okay, so if any of you have not seen it, let me switch to the browser real quick. I'm just such a fan of this website. Maybe make this bigger. So you can type just about any web technology in here that you can think of, and it will pop up and tell you, resource hints, for example. Which browsers support it at which versions. So Edge supports it, IE supports it, the others don't. Resource hints, DNS prefetch, they pretty much all support it unless they're really old. But one of the standards that we leverage in RUM is resource timing, and you can see there are versions of browsers that did not support it. Most notably, Safari 10 did not support resource timing at all. There are still a few people out there poking around the net with Safari 10, or IE 9, believe it or not. So that's my plug for Caniuse. So what kind of timers do we collect? These are the primary ones. It's everything from the beginning of the page load, how long does it take that first byte of data to come in, DNS, TCP, SSL, and so forth. The ones that I focus on most with customers that I think are most relevant to the user experience are going to be first contentful paint. That's the point in time at which the user first sees something happening on the screen. They're seeing something painted. Visually ready, which is when the viewport is fully visually done, the above the fold paint render time. And timed interactive. Now, timed interactive is really tricky because that's supposed to tell you when can users interact with the page, when can they click on something or scroll and have it be performant. Google and Akamai and Blue Triangle, we all measure this in different ways. There is no W3C standard for how you measure timed interactive. So depending on the tool you use, you want to pay particular attention to how they define it. At Akamai, we look for 3 things. We look at the page busy indicator in the browser itself. We look at the first point in time when you've gone 500 milliseconds without a JavaScript long task being executed, a JavaScript task that's taking more than 500 milliseconds. And we look for when the frame rate in the browser is faster than 20 frames per second. Google has a slightly different definition that includes a 5-second delay, or 5 seconds of time after the last JavaScript long task. So in general, Google's timed interactive is going to be a lot slower than our timed interactive. But those are the ones that we focus on. One that I think is kind of interesting that maybe someday people will pay more attention to is rage clicks. We actually can track when somebody clicks within the same 10 by 10 pixel space on the window, like I think it's more than 3 times in a second. So if they're doing that and you see that show up a lot, that means that the page is not doing something as soon as people really want it to do. So we collect this data and we visualize it in real-time dashboards. This is one from Akamai Impulse, and this is a similar one, or one from Google Firebase. Every vendors are going to look slightly different, but I think the key thing if you're thinking about RUM is that you want it to be real-time. A few years ago, it used to be common for some of these web analytics tools to, you'd only be able to look at the data an hour after it was collected, or in some cases a full day after it was collected. You really need to be able to jump on stuff right away. Alerts and reports, I think, are really important, and so there are some ideas here about how do you think about them and what's important about them. Some things that I think are important are the ability to trigger pretty quickly on changes. At Akamai, we can do alerts based on the last 5 minutes of activity. We tried going down to 1 minute, but it gets you end up with a lot of false alerts just because beacons are coming in at the same time you're trying to alert, and it's challenging. So we've sort of settled on 5 minutes as being the fastest we can react on. If you're looking at things like conversion rate, though, and you want to alert on that, though, you may want to have a longer delay, like 60 minutes, just to avoid false positives. Can you ignore maintenance windows? Can you trigger off both business performance or both performance and business metrics, combinations of them? Will the alerts annotate your dashboard data? So if you have a time history graph in the dashboards, you'll be able to see when the alert's fired. These are all things to think about with alert systems. Another feature that you really want to focus in on in real user measurement system is something that in Akamai we call a custom dimension, and in Google they call a custom attribute, and I actually don't remember what Blue Triangle calls it. But the idea is to be able to segment or filter the data in ways that are custom to your site potentially. So the classic use case for this is if you do A/B feature testing or A/B testing in production. So is anybody here using like Optimizely or something to feed different versions of pages to different populations of visitors? Yeah, a few people. Yeah, this is something that Amazon really became one of the big promoters of. Amazon would do a lot of experimentation on their site where they'd feed slightly different versions of a product page to a sample of the visitors, maybe 5 or 10% of the visitors, and then see, did that make a difference in revenue? Did people like that page better than the other one? And then that helped them, through many experiments, tailor the site to maximize their revenue. And most A/B feature testing out there focuses in on user behavior. Did it help conversion or hurt conversion? Most don't have a native looking in at how does it affecting performance. But with real user measurement systems, you can hook into those. You can hook into whatever JavaScript variable or query string parameter or whatever identifies what test segment that page came from, and you can see, this test case B resulted in lower conversion rate. Was that because it was slower? And if so, was it slower all across the board, or was it just slower for Android visitors, or what's going on? You can get those hooks in a RUM system to help you make those decisions. Some other things you may want to segment on that are pretty common are things like languages. If you serve pages in English and Spanish, you may want to check to make sure that you're not doing something bizarre with one of your languages. Or if you're customizing for different regions, like Europe versus USA, you may have different third-party services in Europe than you do in the United States. So they may have different performance profiles. Personalization for return visitors. If your homepage has potentially personalized content for somebody who's already been to the site before, does that make it slower? If so, by how much? Logged in, logged out. Was this an in-store kiosk machine, or was this somebody coming in online? On a product page, was there video on the page or not on the page? And then potentially you can drill into things like campaign codes or coupon codes if you want to track, are people from certain campaigns getting better or worse performance. And then lastly, one of the things that you can do with Impulse, with real user measurements, and we do this a lot at mPulse. This is, I think, a big feature of our particular offering, is try to make that connection between performance and business intelligence. And so we at Akamai have a lot of tools like this what if tool, as we call it, that lets you play around with, okay, what if my page load time was a half second faster? What would result in it? So in this case, I think this screenshot, we made the page load time 300 milliseconds faster. We have a data model where we look at your own visitor traffic and say, well, people who had a 300 millisecond faster experience, they converted at a slightly higher, a 0.2% higher rate, and their order totals were this much more, and bounce rate was this much better, and so forth. So that may not be your focus if you're a developer or in operations. So I'm not going to talk about it in depth, but that is something that real user measurements can help you with. So a few best practices if you do want to get into this, some things to know about. There are some limitations because this is a JavaScript data collection system. There are some JavaScript cross-origin resource sharing restrictions that you need to be aware of. The principal one is that if you're trying to get resource level data, because of the cross-origin resource sharing restrictions, you can't get component timings, things like SSL, DNS, TCP at the resource level, unless it's from the same origin as your base page, or the origin that serves it has set something called a timing allow origin header that says basically I'm allowing you, even though you're not in my origin, to ask for these details. So we encourage that if you have like a www and an images domain, we encourage you to make sure that timing allow origin is set on the images.example.org domain, or whatever your domain is. The resource timing standard, which we rely on to get our resource level data, also has a default in the standard that the browsers are expected to retain information about the first 150 resources on the page. That's often not adequate for a lot of sites. Many sites have 200, 300 resource request pages. It's a very simple JavaScript code you can put on your site to increase the buffer size. And then finally, something I think most people don't leverage enough is user timing. Has anybody here used the W3C user timing API? Know what it is? So user timing is a W3C standard. All the major modern browsers support it. It allows you to create nanosecond precision timing marks in your website. So you create things called marks and measures, and a measure is the delta between two marks, essentially. But you can use it to profile things like, if you have a core chunk of JavaScript code that you think is a potential bottleneck to the user experience, it's doing something really important, and you want to make sure you profile it and understand how fast it is, you can use user timing to create a measure that measures how long that takes. Is it 15 milliseconds? Is it 18? Is it 30? Whatever it is. And Akamai RUM, and I believe Google at least, both have the ability to hook into those and pull those timers out and present them to you in the dashboards and analysis in exactly the same way we do SSL, DNS, and so forth. So you can define for yourself what the most critical timing points are in the page load. And get those out in the same interface that you're looking at things like page load time. And I don't have as many customers using this as I think would benefit from it. But it does require instrumentation in your site and a commitment to do that. So how do you get this into your platform, your processes, your culture? I think one of the big ways to do that is through APIs. So at Akamai, for the last 2 years, we've had a big emphasis on automating everything. It's sort of our internal motto. And we're doing that through APIs. Basically, we've made this commitment, this idea that anything you can do through a user interface in a portal, you should be able to do through API calls. Because that way you can automate it, you can bake it into things like release processes, your Jenkins scripts that push out a build. They can make API calls to do various things at Akamai, including interface with the RUM data. So there are 3 big things you want to look for when it comes to APIs in a real user measurement system. One is the ability to create and update your configurations. That's actually the least important one because it's not something you're doing every day. But you definitely want to be able to use API calls to annotate the RUM data, and you definitely want to be able to query the RUM data and get out summary information about what's going on through API calls. We'll talk about that some more in the next section here. But before I go on, any questions? Am I leaving anyone behind? Everyone's fully engaged?
So you mentioned those annotations are going
Yes, yes, I will show them. In fact, the very next section here. So how do you integrate this? The core idea is to sort of programmatically interact with RUM data. Instead of going to a real-time dashboard, as cool as they are, as neat as it is to see the histograms and the charts and the graphs and the maps, being able to interact with stuff through APIs leverages a whole nother opportunity to leverage the data effectively. And the two big things that we encourage customers to do is to annotate the RUM data and to use the RUM data to validate with releases, to bake it into your release pipelines. And so I'm going to talk about each of those in a moment here. So annotations, I think of these as like breadcrumbs for diagnostics. So in an Akamai mPulse dashboard, the way these show up is you get these little triangles down here on your time history graphs. And so if there was a big spike in performance here, you could go and you could look and see, okay, well, what happened there? And we, by default, will put those annotations in for any alert that fires. But we have an API that lets you put in things like, hey, we did US East maintenance. You know, our site is leveraging AWS US East resources. We upgraded the web servers in that AWS location. So here we go. We have an annotation, and we can go back and look and see, it didn't really affect performance in any way. Good. Yes, question? Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see what was their entire experience from the time they visited the site. Maybe they tried to purchase the product.
So it depends on the vendor. Akamai does not let you do that. We don't track, well, so we do track visits, but we don't try to identify visitors. So if you happen to know the visitor came with this IP address, you could probably find them in our system and look at the 7 or 8 pages they visited during that visit. But we don't make any effort to, say, connect that visit with their visit yesterday. So in the Akamai system, no, we don't have that ability. But other vendors may let you do that. Being able to track individual visitors and that sort of focus, those web analytics tools are geared more toward that. So something like Adobe Analytics, they'll actually assign a unique visitor ID to each visitor, and they'll try to track them across visits and so forth. And so those services will have richer tools to like investigate a given visitor's trace through your site. Most of the real user measurement services are going to focus more on the aggregate, like here's what's going on with the 10,000 visitors that came to us in that same minute. So that's it. Any other questions? Okay. So I'm going to just show you a bit in the browser here. So I have this open to, this is demo data. It's not a real customer, or it was a real customer, but we've obfuscated it. Maybe make this bigger. But you can see here we've got a bunch of alerts and so forth set up here. This is what the annotations look like. And in our system, we have the ability to go in and add annotations directly here if you want to do it by hand. If you're looking at this and he's like, oh, I remember on that time, Bob tipped over his Diet Dr. Pepper and it blew up a server. Oops. But what we encourage you to do is put these in programmatically. As I try to get back to this. So I think if what you're doing with annotations is, if you really commit to this concept, you're going to get annotations for every alert that happens. So every anomaly, every event that happens. You'll get alerts for every time you change anything. Server releases, updates, maintenance, patches, whatever. If you do that thoroughly, then what will happen is oftentimes you'll have some kind of performance anomaly, and you'll go into these dashboards and you'll see that there's already like 2 or 3 annotations there that you could identify right away. Hey, my APM system just sent in an annotation that says, you know, we ran out of disk space, or our swap space got low, or this application server went down and we had to load balance to the others. You could oftentimes get your diagnosis directly just going to the annotations, because some automated system has used the API to send in an annotation that tells you what broke. That saves a lot of time. It's super efficient, and it's something that I wish more of my customers leveraged more thoroughly. There's no reason that you have to limit the annotations in a real user measurement system to like what's happening with the alerts from that system. You should be able to send in through API calls, and this is just an example here of a API call using curl. You should be able to send these in from just about any system in your ecosystem. Question? Yeah, that's an interesting concept. We don't offer that yet, but it is. Yeah, there's been talk about that. But yeah, it'd be nice to be able to say, okay, we've identified this visitor as, you know, they're getting a bad experience. We're going to dial down the fidelity of what we give them. You know, low res images, turn off features, that sort of thing. Most of the real user measurement systems I know of don't offer that at the moment. The other major use case is going to be integrating mPulse or integrating real user measurements into release pipelines. And we have a few customers that do this already. Some of them are fairly sophisticated, in fact. But the main idea is when you release something, you want to be able to validate right away that it didn't make the experience slower. So this is a screenshot from a sample Jenkins build where it's sort of been kind of abstracted here. But the main idea is after we release the build and push it out, we're going to wait a certain number of seconds, and then we're going to make this call. This is a call to the Akamai command line interface tool, which is using our APIs to get mPulse data, summary mPulse data, and shove it into a JSON file where we'll then, in a post-process, examine it and see did it meet or fail our performance targets. Most of my customers will use some static targets, like when we push this out, if the page load time goes above this static threshold, we're going to bail on the release. I have a few customers that are as sophisticated as saying, we're going to store these, you know, we push out these releases every 2 weeks. We're going to store this data going back, and we'll do some kind of more sophisticated, as long as it's within, you know, some dynamic threshold percentage of the last, you know, 12 weeks or something, we'll accept it. But whatever strategy you do, the main idea is you're going to release something, you're going to wait a bit of time for data to come in on the new version of the site, you're going to measure it, and you're going to decide whether or not to accept the release based on that criteria. Many of my customers do this fairly short. The time range they wait is pretty short, like an hour. I do have a customer that waits a full week. So they'll push out a release, and then 1 week later, they go out and they validate, you know, in the last week has the performance changed enough from the previous week to merit rolling back the release. So let's talk a bit about ChatOps. This is where I'm going to give you kind of a demo. How many people here at your work use something like Slack or WebEx Teams or Google Hangouts? Like pretty much everybody, right? We use it a lot at Akamai. Pretty much every team has their own channel in Slack or team in WebEx Teams, because for some reason we need both. And I see, particularly on the ops channel, anytime there's something going on, there's 4 or 5 people in there together working on things, sharing ideas. You know, if they have like 3 or 4 hypotheses, they'll spread out. One person will go look up each thing, come back and report what they found. It makes things super productive, this kind of interface. And so we had this idea a year ago, like, hey, wouldn't it be great if, rather than going out to a separate tool to go fetch the RUM data and then report back what you saw, what if you could do it right in Slack? Or what if, when something goes wrong, you could have notifications come directly to that Slack channel with the option to like just act on them right away. So I'm going to show you how both of those work or can work if you implement them. So we're going to start, our first scenario is using alerts and chat ops. And so this is an Akamai Impulse alert configuration. All the other major vendors will have something similar. But the key thing here is that our action when the alert fires is not notify users, it's not send an email, it's calling a webhook. And I think all of the vendors that I know of have the ability to send webhooks. And the idea behind a webhook is you basically fire off a URL here using get method with some headers maybe, depending on the webhook. And then whoever receives that webhook reacts on it. Slack actually has the ability to take webhooks directly. You can fire off a webhook and send stuff straight to a Slack channel. In this example, we have another system running, our Akabot. So we have a bot running that's going to receive the webhook and then decide what to do with it, and maybe that involves using a Slack webhook to pass it on to Slack. The clients like Slack, actually most of them have the ability to have bots inside them as well. And so we've actually implemented in Slack a Slack bot that will go out and using our API calls interact with our RUM data interactively in Slack. So let me pull up our demo here. So this is Akamai Impulse, our RUM system. I'm kind of hiding a few things here, but this is a demo app that we used from something we called Services Academy last year. And I have in alerts here, I have 2 alerts set up. One is for a slow backend. So we're doing, if this app's backend time 50th percentile is slower than 1 second, that's a problem. We want to be alerted right away. The action we're going to do is we're going to send a webhook, and we're actually going to be able to put into that webhook some dynamic information based on the current state of the RUM data. So whatever the current 50th percentile backend time is, it'll throw that into the webhook. Other vendors should have fairly similar concepts. And then the other alert we're going to set up is based on errors. So if the network error rate exceeds 5%, more than 5% of our requests are throwing errors, that's a problem. And again, we're going to fire off a slightly different webhook.
Can you filter out false positives? Like, a user on a really slow network would show that their backend is bumping like super slowly, right?
Yeah, so this is not looking at a per user experience. So let me pull this up. Yeah, so in Impulse, we like to use 50th percentiles or percentiles in general rather than averages. But this is looking at basically every visitor for the last 5 minutes. What is the median back-end time? And if that's exceeding 1 second, then you know there's an issue. We generally wouldn't want to do something on like if a single user had this bad experience, just because if you look at millions of visitors, you'll eventually find people who get like 30-second back-end times, and it may have nothing to do with your site. may have everything to do with them. Okay, so where'd it go? All right, so here is my Slack window, and I did that to make it fill up. And I'm going to simulate what this should have it preloaded here. No, it's over here. Okay. So I'm going to simulate what, if the alert had fired, it would fire off this same webhook here. What you should see in a moment here is our Akabot took the webhook and decided, okay, I need to pass this on to Slack, this particular channel. So I'm getting in Slack right away. Maybe I'm the operations team or I'm the dev team. I see a message, hey, there's an Impulse alert, slow backend time. The first byte was 5,000 milliseconds. The onload was 7,000 milliseconds for this app. And that right away, everybody who's on the channel needs to know about it, sees it, and you can immediately start talking about like, hey, what's going on? Let's figure it out. It's a really cool feature. The other use case here, let me hide that for a second. is what happens if there are errors. So we have, go back to the, so the other alert we had here was, oops, was our errors alert. So the scenario here is, let's say you've released a new feature. Akamai has something called Cloudlets. Let's say it released a Cloudlet that helps you do something at the edge that you don't do at the server side, and you're starting to get a bunch of errors for it. Well, we can set up a webhook, an alert system that says, hey, if we're getting errors above a certain threshold, let us know. And I'm going to simulate what that would look like by firing off the webhook that would result in. And then in the chat window here, in just a moment, you'll see, aha, we got a message. Several Impulse error alerts have fired. The version with the errors is version 250. The previous active version was 249. Would you like to roll back? So you can actually incorporate this into your development your release pipeline, so that, let's say you, so one of my other colleagues is apparently watching this channel right now. You can put this into the release pipeline. It fires off this, oh, we're getting a bunch of errors. Maybe I just want to ignore it for now. Okay, well, you investigate it. Hey, look, we're still happening. We're getting more of these errors. Well, now I decide, okay, I want to roll back. Are you sure? Yes. And so you can bake in this functionality directly into your chat application. And this saves a lot of steps of having to decide, okay, we're going to roll back. I have to go into another terminal to roll things back, come back to the Slack channel to tell everyone, okay, I rolled it back. It may get documented in the Slack channel in a different way every time it happens. This way you can come up with your process, your flow, bake it right in. It's integrated directly into measuring the performance of the site. And so you can start leveraging this idea that, ultimately this is going to change your culture, right? When performance becomes important enough that you can bake it into the processes like this, everybody's going to know we can't release something that's slow or that's going to cause errors, because it's going to come back to us because it's baked in directly. So that's managing things like alerts and releases. The last thing I'm going to show you. The last thing I'm going to show you here is building the app into the. I don't want active. I was hoping it would pop up the list of stuff here. I'm trying to remember what the code was again. Page load. Okay. So we can build apps into Slack directly, including one that we've built into this particular Slack channel called Page Load. So if you're in the middle of an incident, or you're just curious to see how things have been going, you can just type in directly, show me the page load for the last day. And it takes a second to go back, gets the API data, fetches it, builds it into an image, and it'll show up here in just a moment. This saves steps as opposed to having to go to a portal, grab an image, come, send it back. You can see here, here's how things have been going for the last day. We only have breakdowns for 3 countries, so forth. This one up here, this is looking at geo for the last, whatever time period. So you can build these apps into your Slack or your WebEx teams and leverage the APIs from Impulse to get stuff directly into your operations that way. So that pretty much concludes what I was going to show you. I hope one thing you take away from this is the idea that performance really is important. I think it's worthwhile to not just have a real user measurement system, but to try to take it the next level deep and integrate it into your pipelines, have every system report back into it, connect it deeply, Because that way, when you do have problems or when you do need to justify, hey, this release went well, somebody asks you and you really want to prove it, um, you will have all the tools you need at your disposal to do that with confidence and basically make sure that everybody is focused on delivering the best possible user experience. So with that, I'll take any questions, comments. Yes? Yeah, so that's called user timing. It's a W3C, World Wide Web Consortium standard API that pretty much all the browsers support. Well, no, but it's supposed to be nanosecond precise.
On that, I'm guessing that as part of mitigations for spectrums, that sort of thing, they've actually decreased the precision on those APIs relatively recently.
Okay, it's possible. I'm not really an expert on that, but MPulse, if you use those timers, even though they're recorded down to the nanosecond, in our system we only display them to the nearest millisecond. So, but yeah, if you're really focused on, hey, I really want to understand this block of code on my page, how fast it is, it's a really useful tool. And being able to import that directly into the same tool you're using to monitor page load and visually ready and so forth, it makes it really super convenient.
Do these timers, do they count execution time or like actual read time? Because if you get a context switch, right, it can last for milliseconds. So
Yeah.
those timers would be
So it depends on how you put them in your code. But I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I don't know if it's. I assume if it was a context switch happening in the middle of a measure, that it doesn't get counted against that because it's. But I don't know, to be honest. Yes.
Do you see an issue as far as data sensitivity moving into something like transporting data?
Well, so the biggest concern a lot of my customers have is with what's called personally identifiable information. And in general, a RUM system doesn't need to collect any true personally identifiable information. We do collect things like IP addresses because we use those, and I assume Google does as well, to do things like geolocation and figuring out what network you're on and so forth. But we don't collect. We don't try to say this person is Bob Smith or Alice White or who. We don't try to connect them. In fact, in our system, we don't try to connect that this session was the same browser as the previous session. So you can visit 5 times, and it's just, as far as we're concerned, it's 5 different visits. That's all. And we have options in our system to redact things like if you don't want to store IP addresses or query string parameters from the URLs, we can strip those out when we collect the data. As far as connecting it to Slack, I don't think there would be anything above and beyond those basic concerns, just because you're showing almost always aggregate information. You're not generally showing data about a single visit. So it'd be hard to know. But on the other hand, I'm not a lawyer, so we do have people at my company, and I assume Google and Blue Triangle do as well, that could probably speak to those concerns a lot more in depth and authoritatively than I am. One thing I do know is that we've run into just very recently, the very latest version of Firefox, actually, they've upped their game on which trackers they're going to automatically block or not respond to, not make requests for. And we have encountered more cases where we think on Firefox people are not, our service is getting blocked, and potentially Google's is being blocked, even though we're not making any effort to track people. It's like some people are making sort of, it's it's measuring people's experiences, therefore it must be a tracker, and so we're finding that may be a challenge in the future for us, or anybody in the real user measurement space, is making sure that we're not looked upon as somebody who's got privacy concerns. Well, so
That's the reason it gets blocked, because it decreases performance when you
Potentially, yeah. I mean, there's no such thing as a free lunch, as Robert Heinlein would write in his novels. um, but I think there's a difference between like Adobe Analytics that is trying to track you and connect your visits with other visits and your visits on this site with other sites to try to create a profile of who you are and what you're likely to do and what kind of products we should be recommending to you and so forth, versus just trying to see this person visited 5 pages and their average experience was 3 seconds per page. Whether or not the public agrees with me that that's a distinction worth making and treating them differently, we'll find out. But
Google doesn't want to be called a search engine, right?
yeah,
Advertise.
yeah. So I mean, I understand all the nuances there, but yeah, that's something that any one of these measurement systems is going to have to. We're all going to go through the journey together. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I'd like to raise somebody else ask the question about being able to have that feedback loop and being able to act on the performance metrics. I think that would be really powerful. I just imagine the possibilities.
Yeah.
We could not only decrease the image quality, we could actually communicate with the user and maybe let them know that it's not our website that sucks, it's maybe your connection, right? And
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope it was worth your time, and appreciate the audience. Thank you.
All right, so we have the room until 9. That gives us about 25 minutes, so we can hang out here for a little bit, and then after we're kicked out, we can head on downstairs. So feel free to join us, hang out, socialize, go home, and do whatever you like. So thanks for coming out.